To our first discussion today, the World Bank plans to reverse the global poverty line from $1.90 to $2.15 due to increases in the cost of basic food, clothing, and shelter across the world. This was contained in the fact sheet post titled An Adjustment to Global Poverty Lines, which was published on the bank's website on Monday. The post reads in part, as differences in price levels across the world evolve, the global poverty line has to be periodically updated to reflect these changes. Since 2015, the latest update, or the last update, we have used $1.90 as the global line. As of fall of 2022, the new global line will be updated to $2.15. Well, in a related development, the World Bank, in another report titled A Better Future for All Nigerians in 2022 Poverty Assessment, says the number of poor Nigerians is projected to hit 95.1 million in 2022. Well, let's get talking. Well, I have him live in the studio. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise. He's also the former Director General of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Dr. Muda Yusuf is in the house. Good afternoon, sir. It's good to see you.
Good afternoon, Tulu.
Yes.
Pleasure.
Happy celebrations. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. World Bank has lately, of course, after the IMF meetings and the spring meetings, a lot of reports have come up from them, energy prices, subsidy issues, and all of that. But revising the global poverty line and all of these issues that they are stating, clothing, shelter, and of course, access to the world and all of that. What do you make of this report before we now move into some basic things that are identified in this report?
You see, the report just goes to emphasize the significance of inflationary pressure on poverty. Because if there is any major challenge that the poor people are facing, not just in Nigeria, across the world, is the impact of inflation on their purchasing power. So what this report has done is to underscore the fact that whatever nominal income people are earning before the challenges of this hyperinflation has been severely impacted by inflation. Therefore, the purchasing power has reduced, and the capacity of particularly those who we say are at the bottom of the pyramid to access basic needs like food, like maybe pharmaceuticals, like shelter, clothing, and all of that. Those things have been impaired. Access to those things have been impaired. And the implication of that is that more and more people are dropping into poverty. Now, by the account of our own National Bureau of Statistics, the latest report we had on issues of poverty was in 2019. And poverty incidence or poverty rate at that time was about 41.3%. If you estimate it in terms of numbers, it gives us a population below poverty line of about 83 million people, which is significant. Yeah. And from the report that you read out now, the World Bank is also projecting that this will get to around 95 million people. So poverty has become an emergency, the poverty situation. And one of the things we need to do also as an emergency response is to deal with the problem of inflation. And that is the challenge of many governments around the world. Governments are deploying a lot of policies. We must admit, though, that in Nigeria, we have seen a number of poverty reduction measures by the government. You know, we've seen the social investment program.
To say, what can we bring? What's the effect? We remember the SME funding, all of this.
The Empower,
what's the impact?
All sorts of this. So the issue is that the problem is much bigger than these interventions. I mean, we are talking about over 80 million people. So how many people can you give all these handouts, Empower? How many people can it impact? And that is why the World Bank was talking about, in addition to these social investment programs, we should have some key reforms in place. You know, reforms around the fiscal reforms, some macroeconomic reforms, We should address the issues of insecurity. And there is also what we call the non-monetary indicators of poverty. Because when we talk about these $2.15 per day, that is monetary. You can even have that and still be poor. If you look at some of these non-monetary indicators, like access to education, access to potable water, access to good shelter, access to good health, these are also non-monetary parameters through which you can measure inflation. So it's a major issue, and if you are really serious about tackling this problem, we need to see what we can do from both the monetary side and the fiscal side, and other even the structural sides, to see what we can do to bring down the cost of living. I mean, if you look at basic things like food,
Yes.
even though we say that inflation was around 15.7 or 16 point whatever, if you look at the inflation around some of these basic items, it has ranged between 50% to 100% over the last 1 year.
Sure.
And you can imagine the impact of that on the poor people. So if people are complaining that things are difficult, things are hard, it's because of that. And those who are, worst hit are those who are on fixed income. I'm talking of those whose incomes are not increasing.
Yeah, not increasing.
And we have many of those people in many employments. We have the unemployed who don't even have an income at all. We have those who are pensioners who have also fixed income. Then we have also the impact on savings. Because for many people who are depositors now, what they earn on their deposits is negative in real terms.
It is.
It's negative in real terms. So even their savings and deposits are losing value by the day. So practically all constituents or all components of the economy are hard hit by this.
Let me follow up. It was COVID-19 in the first place, and we say we're getting out of COVID-19, numbers dropping. China is still not looking very good now. It's some kind of lockdowns and all of that. So some will say it's like a global issue, that poverty, the figures are getting higher everywhere. So what is different with Africa's most populous nation? Because when you look at 95 million people in 2022, that's what World Bank is saying. So why it's looking like Nigeria, we didn't just do something right, or we were supposed to do more than we did?
Well, I agree with you. This is a global phenomenon.
Good.
And across the world, different governments are taking different steps, different measures. For instance, to deal with the energy situation, the Chinese government has cut down import duty on coal to zero, just to moderate the impact of all these challenges in Ukraine and Russia on energy cost. In the US, the Treasury Secretary is already trying to put a proposal forward to cut the import duty on some basic things that they import from China. During the Trump era, there was a lot of clampdown on goods being imported from China. But because of the reality of the inflationary pressure and the implication on the citizens, even in US, they're now looking at how to review some of these tariffs. So the point I'm leading to is that apart from these social intervention measures and empower that the government is, which is not bad anyway, we need to look at how we can deploy policy to deal with some of these issues. Policies, for instance, around tariff. Because this is not to encourage a lot more import dependence, but we should be frank enough to know our strengths and our weaknesses. And when you are faced with an emergency of this nature, you need to deploy even some extraordinary measures to calm down the tension when there is so much hunger in the land. So I imagine that we should take a close look at the entire spectrum of our import duty regime. Let us see how we can reduce some of those import tariffs without necessarily hurting domestic industries. We can draw the line. So where we don't have capacity, let us reduce all this pressure on the customs to go and generate revenue. Because in the process of trying to generate revenue, you create bigger problems that are much more than the revenue that has been generated. I mean, over the last couple of weeks or months, there has been this back and forth between the auto dealers, auto combo, the import duty, the 15% and all of that. I mean, this is a country where we don't have an effective mass transit. There are a lot of challenges with transportation. A lot of people in the middle class cannot afford brand new cars. I mean, how many people can afford 20 million, 25 million, 30 million? So even the Tokumbo is bad enough that it's so expensive. Particularly when you take into account the exchange rate. So when you look at all of these things, what is wrong in accepting that import duty on things like Tokumbo cars should be around 20%? I mean, why must it be 35%? Especially when we have suffered a depreciation in exchange rate of over 50% already. So we can look at a range of things. That is just automobile. That may not be directly related to basic things like food. For instance, if you take things like basic food, like bread.
I hear wheat. There's even duty. They're charging duty on wheat.
There's duty on wheat. There's some duty on even sugar. You know, it is not a bad thing to see that, okay, grow what we eat what we grow. But if you are faced with an emergency, you have to begin to review some of these things. Many of these flour millers have acquired hectares of land up north. Hectares. They have invested massively. I'm talking of massive investments. They have imported equipment. They have imported seedlings. But they have all sorts of challenges around insecurity. They have community problems and all of that. So what they even expected to achieve through this backward integration, they are not able to achieve it. The same thing with backward integration under the Sugar Master Plan on sugar. So back to the issue of staple food. Because people are crying. Bread is becoming expensive.
It is. I had the
over
100%.
So what is wrong in tinkering with tariff on those who are refining this raw sugar? Waive the tariff for them, at least for us to be able to go through this phase. And those who are also importing wheat, let us waive the tariffs for them. And call them to the table and tell them that, okay, we are reducing these tariffs. We want this to be translated to a reduction in the cost of flour, which will ultimately translate into the cost of bread. So that is one way to use policy to deal with some of these things. That is just about tariff. And there's a whole lot of things that manufacturers are complaining about, the high import duty on raw materials. If there are raw materials that we are not importing, that you cannot produce locally, it's a time to review it in order to cool down, to calm the tension in the economy, particularly around inflation. So these are measures that can be taken. By the time we engage those who are in production, we engage the manufacturers, particularly those who produce essential goods, and ask them, how can we bring down the cost? Or it's bad enough that you have a forex problem. We have given up on that. But we have some control over our fiscal policy. Let us see how we can. That is what many countries are doing. Even around energy. In many countries now, all the taxes on energy products have been scrapped just because of this high cost of energy. So these are the new things that we should do. And of course, we have the fundamental problems like the insecurity. Even the limited capacity we have to produce, people cannot go to farm. So we need to deal with, because that is also contributing to this inflation. Yes, we know that people are being given some stipends in the IDP camp and all of that, but it's not the same thing as going back to your home, as going back to the farm. And many of them have said it. Yes, they appreciated the government for the little things they are doing, but they say what they want is for them to go back to their homes. And that is the responsibility of government. And I'm glad when the president, during a recent interview, during this Salah celebration, said they were going to do everything possible so that farmers can go back now that we are getting to rainy seasons. So some of these things are some of the things that we need to do. It's not about looking up to the CBN for monetary policy rate or CRR. Those things cannot solve this problem. We need to deal with these supply shocks And we need to deploy some of these policies.
Interesting stuff, CEO. Now, we see the Federal Reserve also making a move, biggest rate hike since 2000. Now, we've seen that from the United States. And the aim is to crash inflation. So are you thinking that Nigeria should also think along that line, or other countries should think along that line?
Well, you see, there are peculiarities across countries and across economies. In the United States, it's an economy that is credit-driven.
Yes.
We have a whole lot of consumer credit scheme in the United States. So aggregate demand in the US is interest rate sensitive. So you can see some measure of impact on aggregate demand if you tinker with interest rates. But in a country like Nigeria, this is not a credit-driven economy. How much of consumer credit do we have? How much of credit do SMEs have access to? I'm not sure they have access to more than 2% of total credit. So that may not yield much results. And in any case, the financial system is tight enough as we speak. CRR of 27.5% is no joke. We are talking of trillions of naira.
Are you thinking the NPC will do something around that?
Yeah, it's no joke.
Go ahead.
And if you also talk to those who are players in the sector, I'm talking of the banks, they will tell you that effective CRR for some of the banks is as high as 50%. In other words, for every 100 million deposits you mobilize, 50 million is being locked up in CRR. And I'm not sure any interest is being paid. But I'm not sure we can verify that. But it's not as good as having your funds. Of course, the CBN has its reasons for doing that. So we already have our own tightening measure that is already in place, beyond what is even happening with the US Fed. So I don't see what more we can do in the monetary policy space, around this inflation, because from what we are seeing, the inflation is a supply side problem. We have structural problems. We have, to some extent, even foreign exchange problems, because part of the solution that even the World Bank was recommending was also a reform of the foreign exchange.
Yeah,
a foreign exchange policy. Yep. Because the foreign exchange policy is also inhibiting investment. Because you need to grow investment in order to grow your output. If you grow your output, you'll be able to moderate inflation. But we are stuck with this policy because from all indications, the CBN is not ready to shift ground. Yeah. It's a very rigid position, and the central bank governor has said it several times. So we should not expect much from that side. So we should be looking more in the direction of the fiscal policy. You can look at our taxation, because part of the non-monetary indicators around poverty is also access to health, access to education. The government don't have the financial capacity to properly fund education. So what is wrong in saying that for those who are private sector investors in that sector, what is wrong in waiving taxes for them? This is a social sector. This is social investment in a way. It's like helping government to do what the government ought to have done. But the government doesn't have the capacity. If you talk to some of those investors in private schools, you'll be amazed how many taxes, how many agencies are approaching them for taxes. The same thing with our hospitals. So we can use tax to deal with some of these social problems. Because what you gain by waiving some of this tax is much more than the revenue, the so-called revenue that is. If you want revenue, you can see the banks that are declaring
profit.
50 billion, 60 billion, first quarter. Somebody did an exercise about that the total profit before tax for 12 banks was over 300 billion. That is where we should be looking to if you want to get more money on tax. So we should graduate these things. So there are some sectors that we need to be very soft on. when it comes to revenue.
At least for the meantime. Interesting conversation. Let's wrap up on this note. We're always saying Africa's most populous nation, and we talk about our population compared to our GDP growth rate, which is also worrisome. Can anything be done? Are we going to have to curb? Because by the projection is by 2050, we'll be around 500 million or 400 million people. So that would also affect growth. What do you think?
You see, China today has a population of about 1.4 billion people. India has about 1.39 billion people. Are they complaining about population as such?
No.
If anything, I think China is reviewing its policy to encourage, more to improve on the mortality rate, to improve on more children being, So I think what is important is the investment in the population. Investment in the human capital. I mean, we are blessed. I mean, it's a blessing. It should be a blessing to us. It should be an asset. Our demographics should be an asset to us. But it should not be an asset if you don't invest properly in them. So that is part of the things that we need to do. There are several countries that don't have natural resources. All they have is their people. But because they have invested well in them, they are able to transform the population into a very huge human capital. And it can happen here. So rather than worry so much, of course we need to worry about population explosion. But we need to worry more about what investment we are making.
On that population.
To make this population an asset. For our country. I think that is what we should focus on.
I must thank you so much. Interesting conversation. I've been speaking to the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Promotion of Private Enterprise and the immediate past DG of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Dr. Muda Yusuf. Thank you so much for your time on the studio. We appreciate this.
Thank you.